than others. So welcome and thank you for being here, because this is probably unlike many other conversations you've had about policing. And so I'm Jennifer Tejada. I'm a police chief from California, from a place called Emeryville, which is across the bay from San Francisco. That's our claim to fame. They're on one side of the bridge and we're on the other side of the bridge. Gritty little city. I'm originally from Ireland. I'm from New Ross. Anybody know where New Ross is? It's where the Kennedy homestead is in Ireland. So it's my great honor to be here at the Kennedy Forum because I feel a connection to the Kennedys. And then on a personal note, my own family has been fraught with challenges in the mental health arena. My younger brother committed suicide 3 days before my wedding, and my mother was an alcoholic and practically drank herself to death. So that could also be considered a suicide of sorts. So I came to the United States and I went to UC Berkeley and got a degree in anthropology. Very useful in my law enforcement career. You may smile, but yes, it's the study of mankind and cultures, and so belief systems are important to understanding behavior, right? So I entered law enforcement with the intention of going to law school, but I was very successful after I successfully sued my first agency for gender-based discrimination and harassment. My second agency was where I really blossomed as a public servant. And I had a meteoric rise through the ranks, and 7 years ago, ended up becoming a police chief in another agency, and then 4.5 years later, I competed for the agency I'm currently with, which is a little more challenging. It's a gritty city with lots of urban policing challenges. And so as a leader in law enforcement, I'm very much cognizant of the challenges that we face in policing today. And as you will agree, police reform is generally on the topic of many political conversations, community health conversations, conversations about equity in race and ethnicity and economics. And so we're very much part of the problem in society today, as many would think. And our answer when we look at policing today is very much an outward focus. And it is, how can we reform policing through legislation? How can we reform policing through training? How can we better our officers? Let's give them more de-escalation training. Let's give them CIT training. And let's mandate this. And all of our conversations, for the most part, are about what can be done externally to the officer, right? We have spent little time focusing on the human behind the badge. And my theory is that if we do not focus on the human behind the badge, we will never see police reform in the way that we all want to see it. Because when you have damaged goods behind the badge, the actions are always going to be challenging and probably not meet expectations. And so in my 24 years in law enforcement, there was a great emphasis on developing this culture of armor. And by that I mean denying an emotional response to events. Really not being able to speak about the trauma that you've experienced, about the stress that you're enduring, because that's a sign of weakness in our profession. And as a woman, it would be incredibly challenging for me to be successful if I were to speak to my weaknesses. So I've had a successful career, but about 5 years ago, all of the trauma and all of the stress caught up with me. And I began to have some serious challenges showing up every day and pretending to be normal. And so I sought some help, and traditional help was what many have spoken about in previous sessions was, how are you feeling today? Not so good. Oh, okay, we'll come back in 6 weeks because my health plan allowed me one every 6 weeks. And so I was circling the drain more and more, and I think not unlike many of my peers, the stress and the trauma of the job had caught up with me. And I found an answer in something that really helped me reflect on what was happening inside me and understanding my body and my mind and the connection between body and mind. And so as a police chief, and my partner here is going to expand on this, but as a police chief, what I started doing once I started to engage and see the benefit of mindfulness-based resiliency training is that I started to introduce it into my department. And we do things, Richard presents a class, a 2.5-day immersion program. We do that, we do yoga, we do these things. I have a meditation room in my department, but I'm fully engaged in investing in the human behind the badge. Because if we don't do that and we don't give our officers the skills to successfully rebound from the stresses and the trauma of this profession, we really are not going to have any meaningful change. It is just putting a Band-Aid on it. And with that, I will hand over to Richard Gerling, who will shed some more light on mindful policing.
Good afternoon. I'm going to hop off the stage. I'm anxious. I have to move around. I took some notes on my phone. I'm addicted to Evernote, if you know what Evernote is. And so I took some notes that there's a part of my introduction here that I want to be pretty clear about getting us as right as I can. So I want you to imagine something for me. So imagine a situation where young men and women join a helping profession in order to become part of something bigger than themselves, in order to selflessly serve, in order to do good, to contribute to the greater good, to build community. And imagine this profession that society calls to serve, to help others, to solve problems in an incredibly complex socioeconomic and geopolitical landscape, for which they are not equipped or adequately trained. And further, with the culture, a police culture that really doesn't support that kind of a complex mission. Okay? So let's talk about data. So the data tell us that these men and women give up 10 years of their longevity just simply for being in the public safety profession. Multiple studies, John Violante, epidemiologist in Buffalo, New York, primarily his data. There's 3 different studies. Some suggest upwards of 15 to 20 years. Let's go with the 10 years. Small number, right? It's kind of a big deal. The data tell us that these men and women have the worst cardiovascular disease profile of any occupation. That 40% of police officers suffer from obesity, that are at high risk for sudden cardiac death, that they're twice as likely to be diagnosed, or maybe not diagnosed, but twice as likely to enter into the landscape of clinical depression. That's what we call burnout. And what we know in the occupation is that burnout will emerge multiple times throughout your career. Okay? We don't call it clinical depression because we don't go see mental health clinicians. So there's a lot more data that describe the really sordid landscape of health and well-being for our first responders. And it's not just police officers. Much the same could be said for corrections officers, for firefighters, for field medics, and then we could even move further into other helping professions. The other data point around police officers is that more police officers die every year through suicide than in the line of duty. So what we have is, we talk about mental health equity it's really interesting because we have this convergence of a public health epidemic that has emerged in the American police institution that has deep social costs, not to mention other kinds of economic costs, alongside a broader mental health epidemic. And we're looking at these men and women who are police officers to be part of the solution out in the field for very complicated issues. And none of this is to sort of absolve the American police institution of its accountability, often unacknowledged, for being agents of the shadow side of the American experience, because we are. And that's a really hard thing to come to terms with when you commit your life professionally, but we are agents of that shadow side. And so what I do is I train police officers, other first responders, but primarily police officers. I train them to become warrior humanitarians. And in 2003, a little bit about me first. I'm a police lieutenant in a town called Hillsboro, Oregon, and that's my day job. I'm also faculty at Pacific University at the Graduate School of Psychology, where for the last 6 years I've researched, along with a team of really smart people, researched outcomes of teaching meditation to first responders. And I've been in civilian law enforcement for 23-ish years. I had a parallel career in the United States Coast Guard, active duty, and then reserve. I retired 2015 after 27 years in the Coast Guard. So I've been exposed to a lot of occupational stress. And at the end of the day, we're really talking about trauma-informed approaches to train the men and women who work in law enforcement. And so in 2003, I started paying attention to the police-citizen encounter nationally in my own agency, and the truth is I didn't like what I saw. I didn't like the what we often call the awful but lawful force response. I didn't like just the attitudes. I didn't like how we showed up. It's much less about the weapon system that I bring to an encounter with a citizen, and so much more about the attitude and the energy with which I bring. Okay? I can sling an M4 rifle and have a conversation with you, and you'll probably not even notice the rifle. It's just there because I'm acting in the capacity of a humanitarian and I'm skilled. Or I can be unconsciously suffering and be completely misguided about my ethos that I carry. And the first thing you see is the weapon system, because that's what I want you to see unconsciously, maybe consciously too. So I started looking at how do we reverse engineer this thing called the police-citizen encounter, and how do we improve it? So I became a student of human performance. I became a student of stress, a student of trauma, a student of politics, a student of bureaucracy. And fast forward today, I train meditation. So what's interesting is I looked at all the different training modalities out there in training law enforcement officers, and to say it simply, and it's slightly unfair, nothing works. Right? We put cops in a room and we tell them, hey, when working with folks who are mentally ill, you need to remember this, this, and this, and this. Oh, and let's talk about the DSM-5. And I mean, a person's diagnosis when I encounter them in crisis is mildly interesting to me. It doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. Because one, I'm not going to remember the details. I'm not a clinician. Two, it's superfluous information. Okay? I left out an adjective that I often use. So we're putting cops in a room and we're teaching to their head. And one of the greatest failures of police training today is, hey, I need you to be more compassionate. We solve this problem. Just do community policing. Be more compassionate. Just don't be so biased. Oh, just, do this, do this, do this. And the truth is, we sit there in those training environments and we think to ourselves, I would love to be able to do that, but I don't know how. And so what do? We put up the wall and we say, this is bullshit, And so we push back when in reality, we're saying, help me, in reality, right? And so if we want to transform policing in America, if we want to engage our communities with policing in America, we have to use science. We have to look at what does science tell us. So I've studied neuroscience. I've studied psychology. And at the end of the day, when I can put a police officer through either an immersion 2.5, 3-day training or an 8-week training or whatever the model is, train them meditation. What am I training? I'm training self-awareness, self-regulation, self-compassion, compassion for other human beings, and other things as well. I'm training pro-social behavior based on a large body of sound scientific evidence. And when we research that, what do we learn? We train police officers. We reduce anger, statistically significant reductions in anger, self-reported, so there's some weaknesses there. In a randomized control trial, by the way, we reduce anger, we reduce aggression, we reduce alcohol abuse. I could probably stop there, right? And think, well, okay, if you can do those things, because we can do the social math, as I like to refer to it. If I'm less angry, I'm less aggressive, and I'm not maladapting with alcohol, because we're really good at that, by the way, maladaptive behavior. How does that show up when I'm in uniform out in the field, right? It shows up in remarkable ways, which we know anecdotally. We need to research that still. But we're teaching meditation to police officers and getting these outcomes that are remarkable. And yet, the institution is still training traditional things. We put cops in a 40-hour crisis intervention training, which, 25, 30 years ago, CIT, and this is heresy, I get it, CIT was a model that had some application. Fast forward to today, what are we training? Virtually the same thing we trained 25 years ago. Not to mention, and not in an adult learning model, 40 hours, here's the fire hose. Hope you remember something, shut it off and move on. The institution is presenting information to first responders and making them to cops, making them accountable to it. That is a predictable failure, right? Until we teach skills that are grounded in science, behavior won't change. Knowledge is not helpful without skills. Knowledge and skills create behavior change, okay? So that's just on the individual level. On the cultural level, I've said many times and created a fair number of enemies, that police culture in the United States is adrift. We have adopted a us versus them attitude, and if you look at police training, we reinforce that with a lot of the really popular trainings out there. And so we're in a climate where we hire really bright, capable, often well-educated, often quite diverse folks in our agencies, especially in agencies like Chicago, right? And what do? Well, we essentially, culturally, force those people to become just like me. What am I? I'm a white male cop, right? So those are some of the cultural forces. Training meditation is the most effective way to transform policing, to transform individual human beings that are behind the badge, and to transform our communities. To open up our hearts and minds to our communities so that we're not insular, so that we have the capacity to meet others in their moments of suffering and crisis, because mine is regulated. Right now, most police officers are in such deep, quiet, maybe unconscious suffering that they don't have the capacity to meet others in their moments of crisis. And we expect good outcomes. I mean, wow, really? So, and this is on all of us, right? So we offer that to you in hopes that you can challenge us, in hopes that you have questions here today in the next 20 minutes or so. And so I'd love to hear from you, field questions, and please be skeptical. You don't have to agree with us. Yes, sir.
I actually agree. I loved hearing this. I think I have a lot of issues with depression, and when I try to investigate that, I think like gender is a big factor. Like what you train men to be, it's really messed up. And then the pathway to my own saving comes through a feminist route. So it's kind of this mutual thing happening. I wonder if you could open up similar avenues in policing where the aims of saving the cops is the same as saving the communities. And so I'm really interested in where this might go. But that was just the first comment. The real question is, I don't know. I guess my experience with officers is that, yeah, you say it's very insular. As someone who's outside of the institution, I have tried to casually ask questions about everything, what's going on inside, the trauma, everything that's the buildup, and the sensitivity and the defensiveness I get either from officers or people very close to officers, just like, you're not getting anything, we can't talk to you. sense that by asking, you have an agenda to come at that. So I found that uniquely difficult to work with, and I talked to everybody about it.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. The first thing, the same solutions exist for police officers as exists for the community. And I think if we open up that arena and explore what is that collaborative, community-based healthcare solutions look like, we're all human beings. And I think our common denominator is that we all suffer, right? Mm-hmm. And how do we suffer? And where do we go to enhance and optimize our health, right? Hopefully the same resources.
Hi, I'm a therapist, and I was interested in this presentation due to the topic, particularly about mindfulness. I practice compassion-focused therapy is one of the models I use, and I work with firemen and policemen, people. And I guess my question for you is how you, as professionals in the field, deal with some of the reservations and presuppositions about these types of ways of looking at things. So I've had some challenges, I think, in my own practice. I think I have some varying success based on, people's level of openness. But I guess I'm curious for even larger audiences how you deal with that and respond.
From a leadership perspective, it starts at the top. Any change, anything that you want to change in your organization, you've got to model it at the top. So obviously I'm modeling that in my organization and putting an emphasis on self-care. Our officers are constantly exposed to ways and programs that they can engage in to benefit themselves and to take care of themselves. And compassion training is a big part of our program. I want to just back up to your comment there, and I want to take a moment and take you inside what is happening in our officers. And from the moment we enter into an academy, we are taught to deny ourselves an emotional response. And there was an example that I saw on Twitter a few months ago of a Midwest agency, and they showed their cadet class. And the tax sergeant had a rubber duck, and the recruits were lined up, and he walked down the line and he squeezed the duck, and every time he squeezed it, it went quack, quack. And he squeezed it around their faces, and if they smiled, they had to drop and give him 10 push-ups. So what is he teaching them? An inappropriate emotional response to something that's really funny, right? So it starts there. And as our officers go through their career, they get more and more of that. And not only that, but they're taught to be ready to react to something at every second. So that fight or flight response is constantly in process. The amygdala is on fire. And when the amygdala is on fire and you're in your fight or flight response the whole time, you're building up cortisol, you are damaging your body without any break from that as an officer. And a lot of times that bleeds over into personal life. So that's just a little glimpse into the constitution of a police officer in society today. And so that's kind of, I think, what you're speaking to is this, I can't be normal, I can't be human, I have got to be on guard, I can't let it down, because that's a sign of weakness. I'm supposed to be this warrior all the time, this person on high alert. But to get back to your point, it's going to take strong leadership. And then, when you say mindfulness, people think, oh, that's that crunchy granola, sit with your legs crossed kind of stuff. That's not for us. And it's really not. And when we explain to people, and Richard does a fantastic job in his workshop, mindfulness that's trauma-informed is what we're talking about. And in my agency, it's been a slow process. and I shoulder tap people who I think will engage. And so it's those informal leaders in my agency who are actually paving the way. And we've had, some success. I had an officer chase me down in the parking lot a few months ago. And he said, Chief, I have to tell you, this mindfulness has changed the way I show up. It changes the way I show up to duty. It changes the way I respond to calls. It changes the after effect. I'm not chewed up with this negative conversation in my head about what's going to happen, what did happen. He's much more aware. He's still tactically sound. He's not losing any of his tactical advantages, but he's just bringing a different person, somebody who's feeling healthier about himself. And so I hope that answers your question a little bit.
I just want to speak to the cultural piece, because your question really goes to how do you bring up the topic and the training of mindfulness in a culture that has a lot of bravado around the sort of the masculine identity around what a warrior is. And so I spend a lot of time, cultivating relationship, and that's not easy to do if it's a new audience, right? However, I call out the hypocrisy just in that resistance itself. Meditation teaches skills that enhance our capacity to practice the warrior humanitarian tradecraft. And it allows us to take in more data consciously, right? It allows us to make sense of that information. It allows us to make better cognitive decisions, have greater cognitive flexibility, and all the while having greater capacity for compassion. And so, and compassion, contrary to what the culture wants to tell us, compassion, as I say to cops, is badass, right? It is a skill that is critical. And if you study warrior tradition across civilizations, across time, with a few exceptions, you're going to see a grounding in self-awareness and compassion. And if you look at a lot of the martial arts traditions that have stayed with us in modern civilization, most of those have a very strong grounding in humanity and compassion. And it's policing that, not just in America, in North America, in places in Europe too, that have sort of diverged or digressed from this space that is both the warrior and the humanitarian, and they have to coexist, right? So, and the other piece is they're suffering so greatly that most police officers that I run across they're willing to try nearly anything if it's going to help them. So in the back, sir.
Maybe everyone knows but me, but can you tell me what you mean by meditation training? Is there a particular philosophy, somebody you follow? And is mindfulness the same as meditation training?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I was trained at UCLA. I'm a certified mindfulness teacher through UCLA, and it's a science tradition, as I like to say. So there's many kinds of meditative traditions from all kinds of different contemplative practices. And so what I teach is, it's pretty simple awareness practices. It's attention practices. It's compassion practices. So it's actually quite simple as it relates to the world of mindfulness training. There's no mantras, there's no incense, there's no robes. Well, occasionally I do burn incense just to mess with people. But it's what I like to refer to as it's transactional neuroscience. So we're teaching skills, and how do I understand what's happening in 3 dimensions of this experience as a human being, and only 3, because there's others that I don't think are necessarily important to go through initially. It's how do I become aware of and manage the thoughts in my head, right? I mean, we all have this narrative that's constantly going, and then we ruminate, and we create all kinds of stress and additional trauma as a result of just how we think. So we have these habits of thinking, which create habits of being and habits of acting, which can be very maladaptive. So we work with the thoughts in the head. Then we work with this emotional being, which most of us are like, oh, I don't have emotions, I compartmentalize emotions. We heard Michael Phelps this morning talk about how he had compartmentalized things and things kind of just blew up. So, and that's what we were taught in the military. You compartmentalize your emotions, and they show up at the most inconvenient times with the greatest of intensities that are often we're not able to regulate them. So we just acknowledge, oh, there's fear, interesting. There's anger. And I throw in ego too. It's not an emotion, but it's an interesting piece of our humanity. I believe that much of the problems in policing today, in leadership roles and operator roles out in the field, is unregulated fear, anger, and ego. And those three things are all healthy, helpful things, but unregulated, they can be very dangerous. So the other component is just the physical body. It's just, just embodying this awareness and this compassion. What intelligence is available in the sensations in my body? And that's helpful tactically, but it's just helpful on a human level of, paying attention to other people and paying attention to me. So we work with thoughts, we work with emotions, and we work with the physical sensations. And we train awareness practices, attention practices, and compassion practices around those things. Up front, yes, sir.
First of all, and most importantly, frequently forget this, thank you for your years of service. And thank you for trying to change a very difficult system. I guess for fair disclosure, Matt and I work for the same organization. As my t-shirt indicates, it says I'm one of those people. It means different things in different places, but probably today it means I'm a person with a severe, chronic, persistent mental illness. But the organization I work for tries to change the mental health system and the police system, the justice system, homeless system, and substance abuse system. Now, the way we do it isn't the way you do it through mindfulness. We do it through advocacy. But I am studying mindfulness for me so that I can deal with my severe depression. First of all, it's dangerous, I think. I guess this is the pushback. It's dangerous to separate the mindfulness from the meditative Buddhist tradition. What you describe as a servant warrior could become a ninja who, in all horror movies, takes a sword and kills half a dozen people. They sit in a perfect lotus position for 10 minutes and then they come up and do extreme damage. So that worries me. I'm sure you have a good answer to that. But, and as you know, Buddhism, the meditative part, is a longer discussion. But what I'm worried about, one of the things that Matt and I are working on is well, first of all, as you may know, Chicago faced a series of shocks regarding its police department. A random killing of an innocent person that was revealed over Thanksgiving, then another thing that was revealed over Christmas, and then just last year, the justice report that said that the police department was racist and mistreated people with severe in crisis. So we're trying to change that. One of the ways we're trying to change it is through a consent decree. It's relatively easy to write a consent decree that says you go through 40 hours of training. I cannot imagine writing a consent decree that says your heart needs to change. And I think it does. And absent the heart changing, everything else seems sort of wasted. I also have a story that you might want to use sometime. I got in a Lyft, an Uber, and I was talking to the guy, and he said he was a cop. I said, I don't understand. Why are you doing this? You make a good living. He says, when I'm a cop, all I deal with is bad people. When I'm an Uber driver, I deal with good people, like you. He said, well, I also noticed, by the way, that you're black. And he said, how do you deal with But I'm wearing the uniform. The police are my brothers and sisters. When I take off my uniform, the police are my enemy. It's a remarkably telling and painful story. How do we fix that? How can I contribute to fixing that? And my colleagues in this room.
So community engagement, it's, I don't know how we fix that. I think one of the fundamental places that we need to begin is equipping police officers with skills that can restore their humanity. Compassion is a skill. It can be measured. There's a number of tests to measure compassion, self-reported tests. And what we know about compassion is that we hire men and women into the profession who have strong social, emotional, intelligence skills to include compassion, empathy, self-awareness. And then over time, those skills erode due to the trauma and the occupational stress. And this is not, it's not a choice they make. It is a predictable consequence of the occupation. And if you look at what interventions we have to intervene in that predictable outcome, it's virtually none. They're all reactive. They're all wait until someone's broken, then try to fix them. And that's necessary to do that. But I think one is that policing needs to get outside of itself. It needs to partner with academia. It needs to partner with other community groups and to train human skills. And if you can find something more effective than meditation, by all means, use it. I haven't yet. But what do we do as a community? I think we build relationship, right? One of the greatest challenges that we face as law enforcement is that there is a underlying, and I understand it, but there's this underlying hostility and judgment towards law enforcement officers in this country. And if you want those officers to come out and have open dialogue, we're afraid of what's going to emerge from that. And when we show up to be sort of, to put ourselves in selfless roles of in often heroic roles that are quiet and unsung, we want to do that. But then when we look around and we see how often, as a result of our own culture, but not necessarily the individuals, we see how we're often vilified. We see how people literally have hatred towards police officers. It's misplaced, unregulated emotion from the community. So I think we have to do community work that gives us a space where we can all enter into, that's respectful, that's compassionate, that's still very difficult, right? And work through, how do we get to a place where, as law enforcement officers, we can engage with our community with compassion and skill, meet our community's needs, build the appropriate relationships, and so that we don't become, in many places, what we are today, which is isolated from our communities and a threat, right? And so we each see threats in each other, and there's no magic of how to resolve that, but that's just some feedback for you. And we'll talk about the Buddhist thing maybe offline. Yes, sir.
So I want to share two quick thoughts from what we've been doing in Chicago. So years ago, I used to do a private practice in therapy. I was a psychiatrist. I run a department. Just north of here. And when I was in practice, I would have a significant number of Chicago police folks referred to me. And one of the most difficult aspects, this goes back to the warrior humanitarian conflict, was the officer to settle down and accept any level of therapy because they were constantly afraid they would become softer and whatever, that they would lose the bravado that was necessary for them to survive, that if they engaged with me, that would be a problem. I never could put that together until I got the warrior humanitarian philosophy. It's very helpful today. I want to go back to what you said, and that is the notion of legislation and training vis-a-vis the person into the badge. So I run a department, we have a large emergency room crisis department. We back up a big police district. So we have a huge number of police officers doing patients in. So we mandated through our local state rep to involve CID training as a compulsory part of what we do. So if you want to work with us, then you have to be culturally more sensitive to our patients. 50%, 30%, 40% response, and I'm glad that I heard what you said today, is because unless we can get to the person behind the badge, none of this training is going to make any difference.
Right.
They will learn it. They will tell me back what they learned from me, but they're not going to do what they want to do. And my concern is back to the water humanitarian aspect. How do I get past that? And is there a way, and I think meditation offers that sort of way by which you can relax and do things without necessarily being vulnerable, if you will. But how do we get to that, the man behind or the woman behind the badge in a smaller training program? So we have X amount of money, X amount of time to train these officers to become culturally more sensitive. And some of them do try very hard to do that, but I think help me out in a way that we can go back and make a change.
I think that we have a lot of science available to us today that is so convincing it's hard to refute. So when we operate in the world of facts in law enforcement, for the most part, and when you provide officers with the science behind the resiliency training, it's hard to refute it. And that's what we do, is we push out the science. How do you get the parasympathetic and the sympathetic system into coherence? You're actually allowed to do that, officer. You can take some deep breaths, allowing them, giving them permission to do that. I give my officers permission to be who they are, the human behind the badge. I'm not looking for a robot. I'm not looking for a certain profile. And everybody who comes into this profession, especially in California, they go through rigorous testing. They go through psychological testing. And you get hired because you're a whole, healthy, psychologically sound human being. And within 5 years, you're a very different person. And that's where we need to focus, I believe, is the formative years of our officers, and just give them that opportunity to understand the science and give them permission to take care of themselves and still be warrior-like, still be able to respond when necessary. We have to have that ability to be tactically sound, to protect people, to protect ourselves. But we don't always have to have this rifle up front, as Richard described, and that's the image. That's not necessary. I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
It's training mindfulness meditation to law enforcement is not simply another training. It is a large piece of a much greater effort organizationally, and so in the leadership of that police organization as well as in the community. Because what we're really doing is we're not simply training police officers. We're changing culture. We're radically stepping into a culture that is unacceptable, quite frankly. And I think the American people in many places across this nation have voted and said, we expect better. We expect better performance from our law enforcement officers. It's hard to refute that. And then you look at just the systemic racism and all kinds of other problems, right? Back to this whole notion of law enforcement being an agent of the shadow side of the American experience. We can only emerge from that place if we train in skills that transform the individual. I mean, it's really that simple. And so for a chief executive to bring meditation training into their organization and not find ways to integrate it into how they lead their organization is, one, irresponsible, and two, is a predictable failure, right? We're looking for quick solutions. Frankly, the crisis intervention team training model emerged because there needed to be some quick solutions. And I would submit to you that if we integrated mindfulness training into that 40-hour training, it would be more effective.
I think that's
right?
the way we should be going.
Yeah.
That was my next question. I was going to ask you about, you mentioned CIT training, and it's now, 25 years old? And
Right. And it has evolved, in fairness, but,
Right.
not much.
How would you bring in mindfulness training
Yeah.
with CIT?
Yeah. First thing I would do is I would take the 40 hours and I would stretch it across probably 4 to 6 months, right? So it would still be 40 hours of training, but it would be over a period of time, so we have some time for the adult brain to learn and to practice. And then I would also maybe add another 40 hours of skills-based mindfulness training, okay? Training around resilience, training around human performance optimization, because that's what this is, right? That's the hook part for us as first responders is, this isn't so we can all get in a circle and sing Kumbaya. If that happens, fantastic, because that's a cool experience, been there, right? But this is about how to perform better. How do I perform in my role as a police officer? How do I perform in my role as a community member, as a family member, right? And so performance is in every dimension of our life. And this kind of training around mindfulness, again, and if we could all just, maybe we become kung fu masters. I don't know, there's other ways to do it, but practically, nothing beats meditation practice. We're training self-awareness, self-regulation, self-compassion, compassion for others, and we're getting all kinds of really interesting cognitive benefits from that. So we're churning us into peak performers, right? We're able to step into flow with much greater skill, right? So I would integrate the two trainings, and then see even just experientially. Don't even research it. What is that like for people? What's it like to not only learn about depression, but to start to feel it in yourself? Because now you become more awake to, wow, interesting. What's my experience, right? And because I think, huge Michael Phelps fan. He said this morning, he made a comment about how he was just running away. Right? And what I've learned in observing my own life and observing the life of other first responders is that we're constantly running away from ourselves. We're running away from the thoughts in our head, we're running away from our emotions, and we're running away from the pain in our physical body. Not to mention the external world. We're running away from relationships, we're running away from our culture. And this is not hard to see if we just pay attention. And so what we're teaching is the courageous skill of coming back to ourself. And that's really, really hard. And the greatest resistance is not getting a police officer to a meditation cushion, because that's actually kind of easy. It's getting them through the first 10-minute breath awareness meditation, where everything starts to emerge, and they're like, oh my God, this is what I've been running away from. And we become more skilled at that, and then they see, oh, I can do this. Oh, wow, I can do this. And they come back. And it's interesting. We just get them through that, whatever that threshold is. It's like, it's like that runner's high, right? You get for the first 3 miles, and it's just so painful, and then boom, suddenly magic happens, and you're like, oh, I could keep running forever. It's like that.
Yes.
So for folks who would like to, the gentleman, mentioned that we all, I could say an organization that would like to support this work and make it, and as it, grows and inspire, more folks to partake. I don't know if there is a particular language or vocabulary or skill that is needed to help approach the departments or organizations in a way that, as a collaborator, as a willing partner, as opposed to however, outside organizations may be seen, when they approach the department to help improve. So the question is, what happened with you? What happened to you personally open you up as a leader to bringing this in, and was that the difference? Was it prior to that you may have been more closed, and so now that happened, now you're more open, now you see the benefit, and then what language do you use now to help spread that opportunity? And maybe there was something that happened with you personally as well, or were you always a humanitarian warrior that just happened to work for law enforcement? But I was wondering what is the big catalyst to get it?
Well, I don't think there's a simple answer to that question. I think everybody's journey is different. For me personally, I've never, as a woman in a male-dominated profession, I've been somewhat marginalized or felt marginalized, and the thin blue line is a different meaning to me than to my brothers in law enforcement. So in a sense, I've been on the outside looking in a lot, so making observations about things that are good and bad and as a leader, I've always been interested in the health conditions of our officers, just because you learn about it as you come up in the organization, because injury and illness becomes one of the hardest things to manage. So before I had my own bump in the road, I had started to look at Eastern Western medicine and actually ear acupuncture as a treatment for PTSD, because I don't believe that there's a cop out there who does not have PTSD. You know, you see trauma the first week on the job, you see trauma the second week, the third week, the fourth week, you have internal stress events, and there's no relief. So I don't think there's a cop out there who doesn't have PTSD. So I was working with a doctor. I've always got that sort of inquisitive mind about, you know, how can we make things better? And particularly as a public servant. And, but serving my people that work for me has always been a responsibility that I have front and center. And so really that's where this came from. And then my own personal journey, I had that aha moment with mindfulness and happened to meet Richard, and just the stars aligned. And Richard's work just really showed me without any doubt that this is the path forward for law enforcement if we're going to change the culture. This is the way to do it. And I'm seeing it in my own department. So I think everybody's journey is different. I just was open to it for a number of reasons.
I would respond, you know, we use the language of wisdom and science, I think. A wise chief executive of a police organization who looks at the data around health and well-being of first responders, the data around performance outcomes, the community's feedback, officer-involved shootings, excessive force. And it's not all dark. There's a lot of great things happening, right? But the wise leader who looks at the data has got to let that data inform their decision making. And so when I talk to community leaders and police leaders, I talk about the data, and there's a whole lot more data points around how healthy your people are. And then I ask the question, what are we currently doing? And then I ask the question, how's that working out for us? And it's kind of meant to be rhetorical and reflective, but we are failing, and we have to get outside of ourselves, and we have to transform how we're leading our people, and it requires diving into learning about what science illuminates for us and how we can train our people. And you know, this training models of mindfulness that I've developed with some colleagues, it's in its infancy. Absolutely in its infancy. We've got some fantastic results. You know, NIH-funded studies. You know, I mean, some really good stuff. And I would point, you know, you and others to that data, and I'm happy to do that. But you know, we have to be willing to fail. For one, okay, I'm going to do this training, and we have to be courageous enough to come back to ourselves.
And a quick follow-up, I'm a son of a police officer who ended up in leadership on the East Coast, and so any data to look at what happens in the family unit or the family units of officers, you know, who've been around for a time. My siblings and I talk, my father passed away a couple of years ago, and we often talk about, you know, the impact of his career, you know, the career, the things we heard, how he expressed things, and so, you know, how those laws went hand in hand, and what did that mean for us? You know what I mean,
absolutely. Yeah, there's some limited research around there. Happy to talk offline about some of that and share some things with you. But you know, one of the things we know is that we take our stress home, right? And there's been some research lately that studies stress levels of family members of first responders, and intuitively we know this, but I love it when the data affirms our intuition. Our family is more stressed, and with increased stress in our family, their health and well-being is degraded, right? And you know, I mean, we all know how to extrapolate from there. Thank you all very much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.